Welcome to this spiritual astrology presentation. Hegseth Hitler, examples of Mars and Saturn militaristic tyranny. I'm Altazar of AltazarAstrology.com and this YouTube channel. And I have over 40 years of professional experience as an astrologer. Most of my subscribers and followers are aware of the underlying basis for interpretation with spiritual astrology. When looking at a political, cultural, and moral issue such as the military in our country. This video presentation is prompted by the frivolous show of authoritarian control by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump by gathering 800 generals and senior officers of our entire military for an $8 million pep talk, as has been calculated by some. Well, spiritual astrology offers a somewhat objective perspective of insight on the truth of basic goodness and love the universe has for issues of humanity's evolution of consciousness. Forensic astrology offers a reasonable insight into the karma and potential predisposition of behavior for an individual. So we'll be looking at the charts of Pete Hegseth and also that of Adolf Hitler as we look at that forensic astrology perspective. Now, in previous videos, I have described the current crisis politically, culturally, and economically in the United States, reflecting the challenge of Pluto in the horoscope of the United States, which is in its return, which takes relatively 240 plus years to come back to its original position that it was July 4th, 1776. So, how does Pete Hegseth play into this challenge? This is the fundamental challenge associated with whether the country embraces furthering the faith and trust in the expansiveness and providence of love and truth of the universe in alignment with nature through democracy, or does our country embrace the ego, fear-based contraction and defensiveness that fosters superiority, condescension, division, hostility, lies, deception, corruption, self-righteous ideology that implies the ends justify the means, and the conservative path, which is promulgated largely by the oligarchic billionaire class? In this presentation, we'll view the astrology chart of Pete Hegseth, so-called Secretary of War in the Trump administration, and review what his karma indicates about his predisposition to behavior as a military political leader in power, and to what extent he is part of the ego-based political path of Donald Trump and the alt-right conservatism. We'll also look at the natal chart of Adolf Hitler, since Pete Hegseth's astrology chart has clear, similar karmic negative behavior patterns. So now on the screen, you should see on the left where my arrow is rotating the astrology chart of Pete Hegseth. And on the right, you should see the chart of Adolf Hitler. Now, first of all, a little background on the chart of Pete Hegseth to point out for those who are not more fully aware that Pete Hegseth has recently been retitled from the Trump administration's point of view, not necessarily fully by Congress, Secretary of War. And that title had been largely since the end of World War II called the Secretary of Defense. Now, where does Pete Hegseth come from? Well, and this is the point that, as I've shared previously about forensic astrology, which I am evolving and promoting. And I also want to preface this by saying that my evaluation of these charts and an interpretation symbolically is not based on my own political affiliation or political philosophy per se. I am more coming from an objective point of view that any well-trained spiritual karmic astrologer would offer in an interpretation and perspective on any of these individuals. And I just want to say that if I, through my evaluation, saw a very favorable potential predisposition and or expression of Pete Hegseth, I would say so. And I also base my interpretation and sensibility of that karmic predisposition based on the history of that individual for their and up to including their current life expression in the world. So with that said, uh, Pete Hegseth was, prior to the Trump administration, a Fox News contributor who regularly appeared on Fox and Friends. Uh, and as many know, Fox News is largely a conservative oriented channel promulgating largely favorable perspectives for conservative right and for Donald Trump. He'd also been on shows like The Kelly File and Outnumbered. He had been an infantry officer in the Army National Guard. He is a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars and Guantanamo Bay, and holds two Bronze Stars and a combat infantryman's badge for his time overseas. So this is the extent of his background in terms of the military. Yet, he's been a lifelong Republican and is from or born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, but uh, many from Congress, especially on the Democratic side, and even those of previous administrations who were secretaries associated with the Defense Department, do not believe to any even minor extent that Pete Hegseth was and is qualified to be the Secretary of Defense, or if you want to call him Secretary of War, based on his experience. And yet, we are well aware that Donald J. Trump's appointments for secretary positions have been largely based on the political loyalty and like-minded political orientation of those individuals. Uh, so, with that said, we we saw recently a speech delivered by Pete Hegseth to 800 or so top generals of the entire world of the United States military and senior officers. uh, which largely was a somewhat condescending speech and pep talk for the proper way to approach the military and or subordinates, even including a disparaging uh, attitude towards heavyset or so-called fatter uh, military infantrymen or even officers. Uh, and also a pep talk for um, limiting or diminishing and or eliminating opportunities for women or any kind of DEI opportunities. So where does this kind of conservatism and contraction orientation towards the military come from? Well, when we look at the astrology chart of Pete Hegseth, is it ironic, coincidence that Pete Hegseth is born on June 6th? And most of us know, raised in the United States and America, June 6th, 1944 was D-Day. That was the Allied invasion of the continent of Europe to defeat the Axis and Adolf Hitler forces of fascist and authoritarian control of the European continent. Now, uh, that can, again, I give anyone the benefit of the doubt in terms of the karma of their chart as to whether they might draw on that karma favorably for their own healing and contribute that to the betterment and progressive consciousness of humanity and our society, or uh, use it from the egoic point of view and lend towards less progress, less democratization. And so when we look at the chart of Pete Hegseth, we're looking to see, well, especially people who are militaristically oriented. And this is not uncommon. So if you're a police officer or if you are in the military or other societal uses of law enforcement, many folks with those astrology charts have Mars aspects, especially to their sun sign or their Mercury, or even Jupiter or Uranus, uh, or the moon in varying combinations. And in many instances, believe it or not, uh, some souls have the karma of coming from the misuse of force and violence, and therefore in this lifetime are called to heal and use their confidence, their ability to use force, and even militaristic violence for the defense or the defense of a country or the benefit of law enforcement to maintain a civilized society. So, uh, if you have a Mars or a Saturn, especially adverse angles to the primary planets, Sun, Moon, Venus, Mercury, uh, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have a very positive and fulfilling life if you take the high road path of justice, law enforcement, and or militarism that defends the greater good of a country or society. And that can be a great healing for you as well as for the country. So when we see the chart of Pete Hegseth, he's not only born on this June 6th, the day of great military invasion, either for good or from the Nazis' point of view, the day of loss and degeneration of their empire. But we see that he's born on a Friday, and he's born in 1980, the year of the metal monkey. Now, when a person is born in the year of the monkey, uh, it implies that they may have a very strong self-will and powerful charisma and an identity that uh, actually, from the Chinese perspective, is an identity that's a calling for healing, creative self-expression. Now, from that thematic point of view, and the fact that he's born on Friday, Venus Day, his greatest growth theme is associated with cultivating a positive, friendly, creative, artistic, dramatic self-expression, which, has been a reasonable path for him through Fox News and the Fox television network. Uh, and, regardless of how you feel about the political orientation of Fox News, which personally I don't support uh, or agree with most of the time. Uh, Regardless, that perspective for Pete Hegseth had been a more favorable path of creativity and soul growth expression. And we see that he has Venus, which Friday is Venus Day, opposite Neptune. And that implies a calling to be engaged in more animated, dramatic, theatrical, or even cinematic expression as an corroborative placement for being born in the year of the monkey. However, sadly, uh, he has, in my opinion, been corrupted due to his loyalty to Donald Trump uh, into the ideological belief in what some are calling Christian nationalism. Now, I'm not trying to denigrate Christianity. I'm a great supporter of and spiritual astrology often corroborates the truth that was taught spiritually by the prophet Jesus. However, some religions and that call themselves Christian nationalists have embraced that path as a superior path and almost an absolute necessity for the country to be taken over by this Christian nationalist ideology, which is also, we see, promulgated by the attempts to uh, put the Bible in all the classrooms, the Ten Commandments, that is, and uh, the extremes of trying to limit birth control, abortion, and other choices that women are supposed to be able to have, the attempts to destroy or limit affirmative action or DEI advancement and progress for various pluralities of American society. So this is all part of the package of regressive, uh, the ideology that Pete Hegseth has embraced, as well as there's many associations with white supremacy as well. So in his chart, this is reflected, and remember the title of this is Mars-Saturn Militaristic Tyranny. So let's start with Saturn. See, Saturn people, many people have a Saturn challenge in their chart. Saturn summarizes the karmic challenge that an individual has. And remember, spiritual astrology is attempting to show symbolically what is a positive path for someone, their free will choice, towards not only contributing to their own soul growth, but that process also lending towards supporting society and humanity. So Saturn in Virgo in this 20 degree, that's the Taurus, the beginning of the Taurus segment of Virgo, is a fundamental challenge for Pete Hegseth to discern and discover what is his calling for contributing to, especially with his charisma and his leadership and or entertainment talent as a metal monkey to advancing society. Well, when a person has that square adverse his sun sign, that implies that he has had a hard karma of not having an authentic trust and faith in the true path of love that the universe desires for leaders to embrace as advancing structures of society. And instead, in other words, to what extent an individual actually really turns their will and life over to the care of a higher power, a spiritual life force, versus spiritual egotism is where people and have throughout the millennium embraced a kind of sectarian dogmatism, their Bible, the Koran, or some other ideology that they consider superior and everyone else less than or even infidels. And so Pete Hegseth, unfortunately, has embraced the Saturnian political conservative orientation of a superior path of an ideology, in his case, white supremacy and Christian nationalism, as it supports his ambition. Saturn square the sun people, some of you may have this, but it's a choice whether you are so driven by a father wound. The father wound, that's a Saturn square the sun, is where there's either been abandonment from one's father, or father was a poor example of being able to integrate favorably or successfully in society, or father was even very controlling and authoritarian and even conservative and pushing that need for the false sense that ego-driven ambition is the way to be positive into society. So often, due to this kind of father wound, a Saturn square the sun person will tend to be, in varying degrees, ruthlessly ambitious and will grasp at any opportunity, even offered by Donald Trump, for greater recognition, social status, and or even wealth and public status in society. And so that's no coincidence to see that he would actually be willing to take on the position of Secretary of Defense, let alone Secretary of War. But to go one step further, I see that it's driven both not only by the uh, intense egotism of the father wound, but he has double trouble. He has Mars in a conjunction. So here's your Mars Saturn. So Mars contributes to the militarism. So we talked about his background. He was in the military, he a tour in Iraq, Afghanistan. So not only driven by the conservative orientation towards patriotism that a Saturn aspect can offer, but the Mars square, that's that's a karma of anger. That's a karma of self-loathing. You see, that is a karma that would incarnate in this lifetime as even more of a sense of a deep-seated kind of shame that would need to be assuaged by being a fighter or even a bully to show his strength and stature due to I don't know what his childhood was like, but due to the possibility of having experienced abuse, abandonment from his family, his father, or a relative, or uh, or even just teachers or other students at his school. And so it's an extreme, somewhat even violent, and even unscrupulous or potentially ruthless desire to elevate one's stature through uh, tireless ambition, hard work, and continuous, hopeful upward mobility in society. And in this case, uh, celebrating it through the ultimate stature of a militaristic position that would celebrate more his own ideological conservatism and approval from his leader, the Fuhrer, President Trump, than an obedience to the Constitution and our democracy. Now, let's see. Well, uh, in the chart of Adolf Hitler, wow, is that a coincidence that Adolf Hitler or Pete Hegseth, they both have a Mars? Now, in this case, a Mars-Venus conjunction, but a Mars-Saturn square. So quite frankly, with Adolf Hitler's trine to his moon Jupiter, Adolf Hitler was actually more of a, uh, until more of the end days in World War II, but Adolf Hitler was more of a sane, centered political leader, even though his ideology was militaristically violent, than Pete Hegseth. See, someone who has a sun square Mars and Saturn has really the ultimate kind of ruthless, self-absorbed, narcissistic, militaristic, controlling ambition that is almost blind to the reality as we saw at his presentation to the 800 generals and senior officers recently. Uh, there was no applause there at that meeting, and there was even contempt in many of their eyes as he was in his condescending ridicule. And yet, you see, they both have Mars. Well, look at this. Mars in Taurus, Mars in Virgo, And if they had known each other at the same period of time in life, they'd very likely be good friends, you know? Venus, Mars, trining Mars and Saturn, and 16 degrees right in between his Mars and Saturn. Uh, in fact, Pete Hegseth might have been, a good general in Hitler's Nazi army. Uh, and we see, look at this, Saturn in Leo. And where's the Saturn in Virgo? Now, the Saturn in Leo in Hitler's chart, Saturn represents his political orientation. So the Saturn square Mars, the Mars Venus conjunction in a square to Saturn has been characterized by now most astrologers as someone who is clearly violently sadistic and would even incorporate sadistic violence into their political orientation. Therefore, we do see 6 million Jews executed, amongst others. Uh, so we see here that Saturn is favorable aspect to Pete Hegseth's sun sign. And also, the Saturn position is in the favorable position to that Mars and uh, Venus conjunction. So, and not to mention Jupiter in Virgo, Jupiter being one's orientation towards growth and relationship to society, is in a favorable aspect to the moon and Jupiter of Adolf Hitler. So, needless to say, if the two of them got together, let's say in 1930, uh, Pete Hegseth could be a great candidate for the Nazi administration at that time in terms of their favorable compatibility. However, now let's look at the United States chart here. And the chart of the United States, as I've used it as an example with Donald Trump's sun sign being right in a conjunction with Mars and the adverse square to Neptune in the chart of the United States and Trump's moon opposite Mars shows that Trump affects the United States through deception, fraud, and a uh, legalistic challenge to the integrity of democracy. Now, the chart of Pete Hegseth, Mars, Saturn in Virgo, Mars, Saturn in Virgo. Their Mars and Saturn are 12 to 20 degrees. So they're right here near the conjunction of Neptune. Again, this adverse aspect to Mars, we see Mars is the planet of war. Mars is the planet of the military. Mars is the planet associated with how we approach defense or aggression. And the Mars and the Mars Saturn of Hegseth being right here within degrees of a square to the Mars in the chart of the United States. Truly, Pete Hegseth is an adverse, negative, and even uh, political, militaristic threat to the democracy and or even the defense of the United States. So I am not coming from being a Democrat or a Republican or following any ideology here. This is an interpretation you could get from any skilled karmic astrologer, spiritual astrologer. This is this is forensic astrology showing you a clear demonstration of whether the chart of Pete Hegseth, or I could take the chart of any individual, and to what extent they have a favorable, supportive, and or democratically uplifting positivity for the country of the United States, or a negative one. And it is clear from this interpretation that A, Pete Hegseth is coming from, and we see through his historical behavioral pattern up to this point, a more ideological, egoistic, and even narcissistic, ruthless ambition, fueled by white supremacy and Christian nationalist ideology, which would, in a sense, desire to make our country like an American Taliban that is ruled by this religious uh, uh, political rulership in an authoritarian capacity. That his chart parallels the proclivity to uh, authoritarianism and violent repression of others for his rationalized, ruthless attempts for uh, ideological and superiority position of stature. And that his chart is clearly deleteriously and dangerous to the chart of the United States because of the adverse Mars-Saturn in Hegseth's chart in a square to the Mars of the United States and in the ninth house, showing detrimental international relations, detrimental defensive circumstances internationally, and an improper and overly authoritarian, aggressive control over the military that would be dangerous and deleterious to the United States defense as well as well-being. So if you have found this video insightful and helpful, I'd appreciate you like this and or also you are welcome to contact me, altazarastrology@gmail.com, or visit my website, Altazar Astrology. And you're welcome to explore even a free introductory reading with me by contacting me and see what spiritual astrology depth of insight offers regarding your life purpose, and or uh, decisions associated with your relationships, career, business, etc.